Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you to Alan in particular for the kind invitation to speak at this conference. I actually started my law degree at the University of Leicester and also taught here for a number of years in the law school. So it's always a pleasure to be back there for effectively is my alma mater, of course. And indeed, I recall about 15 years ago organising a conference on the rights of migrants, and there were particular reference to the rights of migrants in a regular situation, which resulted in a published volume on this topic. And I recall that there are some veterans in the room that participated in that conference, and no disrespect made also for Patrick, because you were both there, of course. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to cover, I'll probably talk more about ILO than Christina talked about IOM, but I'm sure in the discussion there'll be an opportunity to raise questions. And really what I want to do during the course of this presentation is to really present ILO's role in the development of the compact and how we see the compact going forward from a world of work perspective. And so I'll say a few words about ILO as an introduction, and then look at our role in the context of the development of the compact, look a little bit at the compact text as well as implementation. All the speakers before me have referenced those areas to some extent, but I will very much focus on what we often refer to as at ILO, the decent work and labour components of the GCM. And in finishing up, I'll also refer to some of the challenges in the Arab states where I'm currently working. And for your information, the countries that we cover in our regional office in Beirut, that's 12 countries, including the Gulf countries. All of those countries voted in favour of it. And that may seem a little bit of a disconnect, because some of the challenges with regard to particularly the rights of migrant workers are found in that region, but nonetheless, unlike some countries in Europe and elsewhere, these countries voted in favour of the compact. So we see this as a really good tool, I think, to further particularly the protection of migrant workers in the region, given that many of these countries have not ratified many international labour standards. So starting a few words about ILO, and there's a lot of information on this slide, and I don't intend to go into too much detail, but just to say this is a very important year for the ILO. It's our centenary year, 100th anniversary. We are the oldest UN agency, and of course we were established before the UN was established. It became a specialised agency in 1946. The ILO's mandate is a social justice mandate, and on the first building of the ILO in Geneva, which today is the World Trade Organization, the words on the foundation, if you desire peace, cultivate social justice, appear. And this is very much also enshrined in the 1919 ILO Constitution. And as part of that, there's an urgent need to protect or to improve the conditions of all workers, including workers employed in countries other than their own. So, right from ILO's inception, the protection of migrant workers was seen as an important priority. And since then, of course, as many of you are aware, ILO is a standard-setting agency. It sets the minimum standards at the global level on labour-related issues. We have fundamental principles of rights at work, so fundamental conventions dealing with such issues as abolition of forced labour, child labour, non-discrimination in employment, as well as trade union rights, specific conventions protecting migrant workers, and other relevant instruments, not least an important convention adopted in 2011 on the protection of domestic workers, a particularly vulnerable group of workers. And in addition to that, over the years, ILO has also adopted many, there are other outcomes coming from the International Labour Conference discussions on migration, particularly in 2004-2017, as well as a number of non-binding tools. that are referenced on the slide. That's a very quick introduction, and the most recent development in terms of the ILO is a report of the Global Commission on the Future of Work, which will be discussed at this upcoming Labour conference. And essentially the social justice mandate of the ILO will be discussed through the lens of this report on the future of work. And what I've been told recently from my colleagues in Geneva is that in the discussions already that are being undertaken around the report and in build-up to its discussion at the Labour conference, where there's likely to be a declaration on the future of work, migration is featuring prominently, even though the report does not say that much about migration. So that again, I think, shows how high up political agendas migration is. And the report actually does refer to the compact. It says it recommends, the future work report that is, greater international cooperation in specific work-related areas, and notes that multilateral and international action needs to undermine the social contract on which the report is based. And here there's a reference to the multilateral action being taken on migration and refugees, so both the Migration Compact and the Refugee Compact. But what is interesting is that despite the limited references of the report to migration, because nonetheless it is featuring in the discussions in the build-up to the discussions at the conference. Now, for the ILO, of course, given its labour mandate, one of the things we've always argued for many years is that most international migration is actually for work or work-related. And in the latest data that the ILO issued at the end of last year on the number of migrant workers in the world, we found that 164 million migrant workers globally out of the 258 million international migrants. So that's a significant majority. And the three regions that are the most significant are those at the top there. So essentially Northern, Southern and Western Europe, as well as Northern America. And the Arab states, and even though it's only a 13 or around 14% of all migrant workers in the Arab states, that's very significant, relatively speaking, given that it's a relatively small region to the other regions. So this was of concern to us in terms of the Global Compact, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. At the same time, so the concern was to ensure that labour migration was featured in the compact, because often when immigration practitioners discuss migration, they don't discuss work-related issues, they discuss borders, readmission, controls, etc. And given that most migration remains for work, it was important that that dimension found a significant spot in the compact. And secondly, the reference to decent work. And of course, there will be a lot more on the SDGs in the next session, but given that decent work for the first time featured in the Global Development Agenda, it was important for the ILO to ensure that this was picked up also in the compact, especially as SDG 8 has a target which links to international labour standards. It refers to labour rights, and it specifically refers also to migrant workers, and particularly women migrants. So that was why, for us, decent work is more than just having a job. It's a job with rights, with social protection, and with a voice at work in the context of trade union rights or social dialogue. So, just to reiterate, moving to the compact there, in the lead-up to the compact, we really focused on those sort of four issues that I've outlined there, and I've already referenced them. And the role of social dialogue was particularly important. ILO, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a unique agency. It doesn't just represent governments, but also representatives of workers and employers. And it's important for us that whereas it's understood, generally speaking, that when it comes to labour issues at the national level, where there are trade unions, but that's not always the case in the region I'm working in at the moment, or representatives of employers, that they come together to discuss policy relating to work. But that is rarely the case when it comes to labour migration, where very much the ministries that play the largest role in this regard are Home Affairs Ministry or Foreign Affairs when it comes to discussions at the international or regional levels. So it was important for us to, you know, include all those areas when it came to the preparatory discussions, and I've listed what the pre-compact discussions were. Firstly, of a special advisor to the summit, which adopted the New York Declaration. Secondly, the Secretary General's report for the summit, the discussions at the summit itself, and following the summit, there was initially a quartet of agencies, IOM, UNDP, UNHCR, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which were, you know, leading some of the preparatory discussions, which ILO joined later, and we endeavoured to ensure that those areas were integrated into those discussions. We also prepared at the ILO, because in 2017 we held a general discussion on labour migration, which was a discussion amongst our tripartite constituents, where we focused in particular on the governance of labour migration at the national, regional, inter-regional levels, also with a specific reference to fair recruitment processes. We prepared a report for that discussion, and the outcome was a resolution and conclusions concerning fair and effective labour migration governance, where it was specifically stated that these conclusions should be fed into the Global Compact process. Because by that time, 2017, the consultations on the Global Compact had already begun. So it's important for, you know, to add weight to those discussions from these discussions at the ILO. This was also a challenge in the context of what was at the time referred to, and still is of course, the UN General Assembly resolution on modalities for the consultations around the Compact. This was very important because the consultations and how they were structured would really define the text at the end of the day. So if there was no discussion on decent work and labour migration during the consultations, it was very unlikely that there would be a significant place for this area in the final text. And it was interesting actually how in the development of this modalities resolution, the references to decent work and labour mobility, they appeared very upfront at the start in this newer draft of the modalities resolution, and then sort of got, I wouldn't say watered down, but squeezed out by other issues, right? So you went from decent work and labour mobility as a thematic area for consultation to, at the end, irregular migration and regular pathways, including decent work, labour mobility, recognition of skills and qualification, and other relevant measures. And to some extent this was inevitable because this was this resolution was a text negotiated by the states. And then in the context of the consultations and negotiations themselves, you know, we worked together with the predecessor to the UN Network on Migration, Global Migration Group, to prepare for those consultations, and ILO did draft the paper for the thematic discussion on decent work and labour mobility, as well as those other areas. We also participated in regional consultations on the Compact, and so, for example, in the Arab states in Beirut, there was a regional consultation on the Compact, and we had a session there on decent work and labour mobility as well. And our constituents, so our non-government constituents, the representatives of workers and employers, also participated in the global and regional civil society consultations. So, you know, just keeping in mind your earlier point, Elspeth, there were those global and regional civil society consultations which also fed into the compact. But I take your point that those consultations were not necessarily occurring at the national level when member states were negotiating the compact. They're two different things. So at the global level, there certainly was a lot of consultation. And in terms of the negotiations in New York, under ILO's auspices, there was convened a like-minded group of states on labour, migration and decent work, which made joint statements during those negotiations addressing a number of labour, migration and decent work issues. And our concern also was to prevent this retrogression, to ensure that whatever provisions were agreed in the compact, that they did not retrogress from agreed international human rights and labour standards. And that was quite a challenge, and I don't think ILO or indeed its constituents was entirely successful in that regard. So if we move to the text, we've heard that it's non-binding, not legally binding. We've heard a lot about some of these cross-cutting and independent principles. And there are some very good things there, particularly when we refer to human rights, whole of government and whole of society approaches. For example, there are other principles listed. When we look at the objectives, we see a number of objectives that are relevant to what ILO was trying to achieve in terms of decent work and labour migration. In particular, objectives 5 and 6, 18, which relates to skills, and 22, which is on social security. Not just portability, but access to social security in the first place, because of course you can't have portability if you don't have access to social security, and this is one of the challenges in the region in which I work. As far as conformity with international labour standards, there was one very problematic provision, which is found in Objective 6I, and this talks about labour rights, including the fundamental rights, to be provided to migrant workers engaged in remunerated and contractual labour. And this was understood by our trade union constituents, for example, as excluding migrants in an irregular situation. And of course, in terms of the fundamental rights in particular that I referred to earlier, including trade union rights, these are not dependent on a migrant status, as well as other rights in the labour context. So it's not clear, this provision, and of course my view would be that the contract does not replace international human rights or labour law, and should be certainly read with that international human rights and labour law. But this was a problematic provision, and I understand also that some of the advocates for that provision came from the region that I work, because they don't like referring to migration. In Arabic, migration has this connotation of permanence, and so they often refer to it as temporary contractual labour, and we have similar language here, the reference to contractual labour. I mean, this is not often when we talk about migration that we use in other parts of the world. And when it comes to implementation, it is very important to remember that the compact is rooted, and this is the actual words of the compact, in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. This is will be an aspect of implementation itself. Also, when it comes to the UN network, and Christina has already described the essentials, if you like, so I won't go into more detail, only to say that the network, yes, it is serviced by UN, if you like, but it has this executive committee, which includes 8 agencies. So there's an attempt to streamline, if you like, the decision-making process within the network, and that also includes the standards agencies like ILO and OCHR, as well as UNHCR when it comes to sort of refugees and more mixed migration issues. But of course, what's going to matter is how the network will be, how the compact will be implemented on the national level. And the network has an important role to play in that regard, because its principal role, I take your point, Christina, it's not just about implementation of the compact, but it really is to support member states in this regard. And just as a final point, I've listed here some of the challenges that we have in the region in which I work when it comes to the protection of migrant workers, because there are serious deficits. It was very interesting, Elspeth, listening to your description of the case between Qatar and the UAE, and that is based on discrimination on nationality, because one of the features of some of the problematic issues relating to migrant workers in, for example, the Gulf states is precisely that, discrimination on the basis of nationality, where different national groupings are treated differently. So when it comes to domestic work, for example, the best paid domestic workers tend to be the Filipinos, because they're mostly women, of course, and the increase in migration to the Gulf from African countries, those workers receive the lowest salaries for effectively doing their job, the same job. So the issue of discrimination is on the basis of nationality is particularly poignant when it comes to some of the challenges, as well as some of those other areas that I've listed there. But just to say very quickly that the compact actually addresses many of those areas, including one of the most problematic areas when it comes to the protection of migrant workers in the region is the operation of this Kapala sponsorship system, which gives undue power to the employer over the worker, not just in the employment relationship, but also regarding his or her status in the country. And given that, as I said, all the countries in the region have voted in favour of the compact, and many of them have not ratified some significant human rights and labour instrument, the compact can be seen as an important tool with regard to moving forward in some of those areas that I've outlined. So I'll stop there. Thank you.